She screamed. She fought. Her small legs kicked wildly as he dragged her into the truck. Those were the haunting words of a young witness, a memory buried deep for half a century. In less than 5 minutes, between her front door and the sidewalk, 9-year-old Debbie Randall vanished from Marietta, Georgia, on a cold winter evening in 1972. 16 days later, her partially clothed body was discovered in the woods, strangled with her own jacket. For over 50 years, Debbie remained frozen in time, a little girl locked in the innocence of her final day, while her killer drifted like a ghost through the quiet streets of Georgia, untouched, unnamed, unseen, until now, because a secret hidden within the fibers of old evidence has finally spoken, and it revealed a name no one had ever expected to hear. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe to Beyond the Case for more true crime stories that uncover the hidden truths buried by time. Your engagement helps us keep these stories alive and ensures that no victim is ever forgotten. The long shadows of late afternoon stretched across the worn wooden desk of Detective Morris Nix, slicing through the blinds of his small office and scattering lines of light across stacks of old case files. The air was thick, the kind of air that carries stories too heavy to move. An ancient wall clock ticked softly on the far wall, its rhythmic click marking the endless hours he'd spent surrounded by unsolved tragedies. Each folder was a monument to a broken promise. Justice delayed, justice denied. Morris leaned back in his weathered leather chair, gray eyes tracing the outline of a single folder that sat isolated from the others. The label on it was fading, the ink nearly gone. It read only, Randall, Debbie, 1972. He had seen that name 1,000 times before, but today something was different. A soft knock broke the silence. Detective Scott, his younger colleague, entered, a thin, nervous man clutching a white folder close to his chest. "Sir," Scott began, voice trembling slightly, "we just received the results from DNA Labs International. They've completed the genealogical analysis on the Debbie Randall case." Morris didn't move, his gaze fixed on the folder in Scott's hand. His heart seemed to skip, then pound. He had been waiting for this moment for over 20 years, perhaps even longer than that. "We have a name, sir," Scott said quietly. "The suspect has been identified as William B. Rose, from Mableton." The name drifted through the stale office air like an echo. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Morris leaned forward slowly, elbows resting on the edge of the desk, eyes still locked on the folder. "Say it again," he said. "William B. Rose." It was a name he had never heard before, but one that would soon change everything. As the tick of the clock filled the room once more, Morris closed his eyes. His mind pulled him back to the day he first opened that file, back in 2001. He had been new to the cold case division then, ambitious, driven, and obsessed with forgotten stories. Debbie Randall's case had stood out immediately. A vibrant, smiling 9-year-old girl, missing from her home, taken in broad daylight, her life snuffed out before it had even begun. The pages had been yellowed, the ink fading, but the photographs, the black and white images of Debbie, still carried an unbearable brightness. He remembered thinking, someone failed this child, and from that day forward, he made her a promise, one he would carry for decades. He swore he would find out what happened. He swore he would not let her story die in the dust. Now, as the years had turned to decades, the evidence, once silent, had finally begun to speak, and it spoke the name William B. Rose. Marietta, Georgia, had changed since 1972. What was once a small southern town, with its red brick sidewalks and sleepy rhythm, had grown into a city with bustling streets and new faces. But beneath its surface, old memories still lingered. Ask the right person, an elderly neighbor, a retired officer, or a classmate of Debbie's, and they'd tell you the same thing. They never forgot the little girl who vanished before dinner. Even now, half a century later, some locals refuse to drive down Johnson Ferry Road after sunset. It wasn't superstition. It was grief. For them, Debbie wasn't just another story. She was the story, the one that never found an ending. When Detective Nix reopened Debbie's case, he found the evidence box buried beneath layers of dust and time. Inside, there was almost nothing. A few black and white photos, a torn police report, a small plastic bag sealed with yellowing tape. Inside that bag, a single strand of hair. It was long, fine, unmistakably human. At the time of Debbie's death in 1972, DNA testing didn't exist. Even when the FBI examined the evidence decades later, technology was still too primitive to extract answers from something so small. But Nix had kept it safe, waiting for the day when science could do what memory could not. Now that day had come. That single strand of hair, a silent witness from 1972, would soon reveal the identity of a killer who had walked unnoticed among the living for decades. A man who had taken a child's life and then disappeared into the crowd. To understand what happened, we must return to the beginning, to the story of who Debbie Randall was before her name became a headline. Her life began, like so many others, in August of 1962, in the warm, close-knit community of Marietta, Georgia. Her parents, John and Onetta Randall, were hard-working, humble people who poured their hearts into their family. Debbie was their second child, a curious, gentle girl with golden brown hair and a smile that could dissolve tension in an instant. She adored her older brother, Melvin, who was her protector, her best friend, and sometimes her partner in mischief. She loved baseball, playing with her dolls and watching her mother cook. And though she was small, she was brave, a girl who believed the world was safe because her home was full of love. But the world beyond their front door was not always so kind. It was the evening of January 13th, 1972, when everything changed. A Thursday. Cold, but not bitter. The kind of evening where the sun set early and the chill settled gently into the Georgia air. Inside the Randall home, things were ordinary. Dinner was nearly ready. Melvin was resting, unwell. And Onita, their mother, was busy preparing the evening meal when Debbie ran up to her with a burst of excitement. "Mom," she said, "can I go to the playground? I'll be back before dinner." It was a short walk, barely half a block away. Onita hesitated but eventually nodded. "All right," she said, "but please stop at the laundromat and pick up the detergent we need. And be home soon, honey." Debbie smiled. "I promise." Those would be the last words she ever said to her mother. She skipped down the street, her small footsteps echoing on the sidewalk, clutching a few coins in her hand. That walk, from her front door to the laundromat, should have taken less than 5 minutes. But Debbie never came home. When 9-year-old Debbie Randall stepped out of her home on that cold January evening in 1972, no one could have imagined the nightmare that would unfold in the hours that followed. Her walk to the playground was short, a straight line, a familiar path she had taken countless times, a path her mother trusted, a path her brother had walked with her, a path that seemed safe. But that night the world shifted, and safety broke apart like thin glass. Debbie did exactly what her mother asked of her. She ran to the laundromat across from the playground to pick up detergent, then skipped toward the swings where her friends waited. Children from the neighborhood remembered seeing her laughing, smiling, brushing strands of hair from her eyes as she joined the group. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing hinted at danger. And yet, danger was already there, watching, waiting, choosing the exact moment the world wasn't looking. Back at the Randall house, Debbie's mother, Onita, stirred a pot on the stove, glancing occasionally at the clock on the kitchen wall. Debbie always kept her promises, always. So when the first hour passed, then the next, Onita didn't panic. Not yet. She simply assumed her daughter was still laughing with friends, or perhaps standing in line at the laundromat. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the light faded from the sky, an unease spread through the home like a slow-forming storm. By the third hour, worry sharpened into fear. Onita wiped her hands on a dish towel and stepped onto the porch, calling her daughter's name into the cool air. "Debbie!" The sound traveled down the quiet street, bounced off empty yards, and dissolved without an answer. Inside, Melvin, still recovering from feeling unwell, heard the tremor in his mother's voice. He stepped into the living room. "What's wrong?" Oneta tried to steady herself, but her voice cracked. Debbie hasn't come home yet. The words hung in the air like thick fog, the kind that obscures everything familiar. When John Randall, Debbie's father, returned home around 9:45, he walked straight into chaos. His wife pacing the floor, her hands trembling, her eyes red with fear. He checked the yard. He checked the street. He even checked the small spots Debbie liked to hide when she played pretend. Nothing. The family did what any family would do. They acted. They grabbed coats. They grabbed flashlights. And they searched. Melvin, though still ill, couldn't sit still. He ran from house to house asking neighbors the same urgent questions. Have you seen my sister? Did Debbie come by? Door after door opened to the same heartbreaking answer. No. Neighbors joined the search. Soon dozens of people combed the streets, calling her name into the cold evening air. But the night only responded with silence. One of the first stops that night was the laundromat, the last known place Debbie had visited. It was closed. Lights off. Door locked. But the owner was contacted and questioned. He confirmed she had come in that evening. He remembered her small voice. He remembered her polite smile as she picked up the detergent for her mother. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing seemed wrong. But outside, something was waiting. Not long after, Oneta squeezed the flashlight in her trembling hand as she walked the path Debbie would have taken home. Then, something caught her eye. A box, scattered, lying in the dirt, the detergent Debbie was supposed to bring home. The sight stopped her in her tracks, her breath caught in her chest. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't a child forgetting. This was a sign, a horrible sign. She knew right then that something terrible had happened to her daughter, and her knees nearly buckled from the weight of that truth. At the time in 1972, police departments across the country operated under one of the most harmful policies in missing child cases, the 24-hour rule. The requirement that a child must be missing for at least a full day before a case could be formally opened. It was a rule that cost countless families precious time, and it would cost the Randalls as well. When Oneta contacted the police, tears choking her voice, the department explained they could not yet file an official report, but the officers were moved by her panic, moved by the urgency in her eyes. So they promised something. They would search anyway, and search they did. News of Debbie's disappearance spread quickly across Marietta. This wasn't just another missing child. This was Debbie, the little girl who waved at neighbors, the little girl who played baseball with Melvin, the little girl the whole community adored. Within a day, more than 4,000 volunteers, students, neighbors, church groups, off-duty officers, stepped into the cold winter air and joined the search. They searched the creek bottoms. They searched drainage pipes. They searched abandoned sheds, wooded lots, alleyways, playgrounds, ditches, and crawl spaces. Posters were plastered everywhere with Debbie's sweet, smiling face, the image of innocence lost to the shadows. Melvin, her devoted brother, stood on street corners, taping signs to telephone poles, his hands shaking from exhaustion and grief. For him, every poster was a plea. Please bring my sister home. It wasn't until many years later that a key childhood witness, Sandra Walker, finally came forward. But even in 1972, some children remembered something. A truck, a stranger's face, a scream. Their young minds had locked the memories away like fragile glass. Memories too frightening to hold on to. But the truth had been there all along, buried beneath fear and time. Days passed, then weeks. The Randall family lived in a state of suspended agony, clinging to hope, praying for a miracle. And then came day 16. A group of students from Southern Tech, volunteering with police, were combing the wooded area off Johnson Ferry Road, a place dense with vines, branches, and the weight of winter. One student stopped, stared, called out. A small body lay in the brush, partially clothed, lifeless, still. It was Debbie, a 9-year-old girl who had fought with every ounce of strength inside her tiny frame. Her jacket, the one she wore when she left home, had been used to silence her forever. The forest held its breath, as if mourning with the world, and Marietta, Georgia would never be the same again. When the lifeless body of 9-year-old Debbie Randall was found on Johnson Ferry Road 16 days after her disappearance, time seemed to stop. The winter trees stood still, the searchers fell silent, and for a brief moment, the world forgot how to breathe. Her small frame, bruised and battered, lay surrounded by pine needles and dry winter leaves, the very woods that had hidden her from the world, the same woods that now whispered the unbearable truth. Debbie had fought. She had fought hard. Her little body bore the marks of a struggle far too cruel for a child her age. Her jacket, the same jacket she wore from home, had been used to end her life. A crime of violence, a crime of intention, a crime committed by someone who vanished without leaving even a ripple behind. And as the ambulance lights illuminated the forest, casting blue and red shadows across the cold soil, Marietta, Georgia, felt its heart break. Debbie was taken to the medical examiner's office, where doctors worked with the solemn precision reserved for their most heartbreaking cases. The findings were devastating. She had been strangled. She had endured severe trauma. Deep contusions across her body suggested she had been held, dragged, and brutalized. And then, one sliver of hope. A single strand of hair was discovered on her clothing. No root, no skin follicle, just a thin, fragile, unidentified hair. It was too little for 1972, too delicate for the science of the time, but the examiner preserved it anyway, sealed it carefully, quietly, unknowingly, holding the key to a mystery that would stretch across half a century. That hair would become the ghost of the case, silent for decades, waiting for the exact moment the world would finally be able to hear what it had to say. The days that followed saw one of the largest investigations Cobb County had ever mobilized. Detectives worked around the clock. Hundreds of citizens flooded police with tips. But every lead seemed to dissolve the moment it was touched. There were suspects, dozens of them, men with criminal histories, strangers seen in the neighborhood, individuals whose stories did not quite align, but each suspect eventually fell away, leaving only questions behind. Officers interviewed every child at the playground, every shop owner within walking distance, every resident along the route Debbie would have taken home. Some children remembered a truck, a dark shape on the street, an adult watching from a window, but the memories were blurry, buried under fear and childhood confusion. Nothing could be confirmed. Nothing could be proven. It was like trying to put together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Inside the Randall home, grief seeped into the walls. Debbie's dolls sat quietly on her bed. Her baseball glove rested in the corner, still shaped to her small hand. When Melvin walked past her room, he paused every time, hoping, wishing, imagining he'd hear her voice again. John, her father, carried every newspaper clipping in a shoebox he kept hidden under his bed. He couldn't bear to throw any of it away. And Oneta, she kept a small shrine in the living room. A photo of Debbie, a candle, a ribbon from her hair. The house that once echoed with childhood laughter now held only questions. The loudest one, who would do this to a child, and why? Weeks turned into months, months turned into years. And slowly, painfully, the once blazing investigation grew cold. The posters faded in the sun. The flyers tore away in the wind. The name Debbie Randall slipped from headlines. But it never slipped from memory, not for Cobb County detectives, not for the children who had grown up in Marietta with Debbie's story etched into their minds, and certainly not for the Randall family. The case became a wound the community learned to live around, but never fully healed. Through the 1980s, the file gathered dust. Through the 1990s, it sat untouched. And through the early 2000s, detectives believed they had exhausted every possibility. And yet, the evidence box remained exactly where it had always been, waiting quietly in the archives, waiting for someone who refused to let the story die. That person would arrive in the year 2001, a detective with gray eyes, a relentless mind, and a heart that had no room for giving up. His name was Morris Nix, and he would carry Debbie's story farther than anyone before him. When Detective Nix reopened the case in 2001, he knew he was staring at a near impossible task. No suspects, no witnesses, no clear forensic evidence. Only a little girl's story and the hope that somewhere in the silence, something had been overlooked. He examined every page, every report, every faded photograph, every line of scribbled notes. And then he found it, the tiny evidence bag containing a single hair. It was the kind of detail easy to dismiss, the kind of clue that, in 1972, would have meant almost nothing. But in a detective's hands, a detective like Morris Nix, that hair was everything. He sent it to the FBI. He waited. He hoped. But the world was still not ready. Technology had not yet evolved enough to extract a usable profile. So the hair returned. Silent, unchanged, still holding its secret, still waiting. By the time the year 2015 arrived, Debbie's case had become one of Cobb County's most haunting unsolved crimes. Detective Nix joined the new cold case unit, and Debbie's file was the first one he placed on his desk. Not because it was assigned to him, but because he refused to let her be forgotten. He knew something had been missed. He knew something still lived inside the evidence. And he was right. The breakthrough would not come from new fingerprints, old interviews, or archived paperwork. It would come from science and a new method of solving crimes that had once seemed impossible. Genetic genealogy, a technique that could trace a killer through a family tree, even if the killer himself had never left a fingerprint, never been arrested, never donated DNA. For the first time in over 40 years, the case had a way forward, a way out of the silence, and that hair, preserved since 1972, finally had the power to speak. For more than 4 decades, the tragic story of 9-year-old Debbie Randall drifted through the quiet streets of Marietta like a ghost that refused to fade. Some cases sleep, some cases die, but some, like Debbie's, linger in the air, waiting for the moment someone finally listens. Detective Morris Nix had been listening since the day he first touched Debbie's file in 2001. And in the year 2015, something remarkable happened. Something that would bring the past back to life. Not through evidence, but through memory. Her name was Sandra Walker. She had been one of the children at the playground on the evening Debbie vanished. A little girl herself, just 9 years old, running, laughing, and playing with friends until the moment the world changed. But trauma, especially childhood trauma, has a way of burying itself deep inside the mind, hiding in the shadows for decades. Children don't forget. They simply lock memories away where the pain can't reach them. As Sandra grew older, the memory remained sealed. She built a life. She raised a family. She moved far from Marietta. But Debbie's scream never truly left her. Then one morning, after seeing a renewed call for information on Debbie's cold case, something inside her shifted. A memory rose from the fog, and suddenly she could see it again, as if it were yesterday. The truck. The man who stared at her from behind the wheel. The screech of brakes. And Debbie, kicking, screaming, fighting, as he dragged her into the vehicle. Sandra felt every hair on her arm stand upright. She knew she could not stay silent another second. She picked up the phone, and she called the police. Detective Nix understood something critical. When memories fracture, art can sometimes piece them back together. He gathered a team of illustrators, including Jessica Null, a gifted graphic designer, and Amanda Wood, a freelance artist known for emotional realism. Together, they attempted to reconstruct the scene as Sandra described it. Amanda spent months creating a haunting tableau. Debbie represented as a doll, the looming figure of the man behind her, the cold shadow of the truck, the horror written in every brushstroke. This wasn't just art, it was memory, pain, history revived. The illustration went public, and something incredible happened. People began to talk. People began to call. People who had been silent for 40 years suddenly remembered details they thought were lost forever. The past had begun to speak. While the drawing captured the public's attention, something else was quietly happening behind the scenes. The science the case needed had finally caught up. Genetic genealogy, a method no detective in 1972 could have imagined, had become one of the most powerful tools in crime solving. Detective Nix took the single delicate hair from Debbie's clothing, the hair stored since 1972, and sent it to DNA Labs International, one of the most advanced forensic labs in the country. The scientists worked carefully, washing, extracting, sequencing, sorting through the tiniest fragments of genetic information. But even those fragments, what little they could salvage, were enough. They constructed a partial profile, then they uploaded it into a database used for forensic genealogy. And the system began to search through millions of DNA markers in thousands of family trees. What happened next felt like a miracle, a hit, a connection. A name emerging from the dense forest of genetic code, a family line, a branch, a cluster, a pattern, until finally, one name stood out: William B. Rose, a man no one had ever considered, a man who had never been on any suspect list, a man who lived near the Randalls in the early 1970s. For the first time in more than 50 years, the case had a suspect. When Detective Nix saw the name, he dug through old records, only to realize something shocking. William Rose had died in November of 1974, just 2 years after Debbie's murder, by suicide. According to family members, he had lived a life clouded by paranoia, fear, and alcoholism. He believed someone was watching him. Someone would find out. Someone would expose him. The truth wasn't just catching up to him, it was devouring him. But there was one problem. Genetic genealogy alone could not confirm guilt. It could only point in a direction. Detective Nix needed absolute proof. Proof that could stand the test of time. Proof no one could deny. There was only one way to get it. An extraordinary step. A step almost never taken. He needed the family's permission to exhume the body of William B. Rose. When the Rose family received the call, they were stunned. Their relative had been dead for nearly half a century. They had no idea he could have been involved in something so horrific. Shock turned to confusion. Confusion turned to grief. Grief turned to reluctant acceptance. And in the end, they agreed to learn the truth, to give the Randall family the closure they deserved, to help solve a mystery that had tormented a community for decades. Detective Nix filled out the paperwork, filed the requests, and prepared for a moment he had never imagined he would witness in his career: the unearthing of a killer. 2 days later, gray clouds hung low over Oak Grove Cemetery, casting long shadows across the aging headstones. Rain fell lightly. The air was thick with quiet and history. Detective Nix and Detective Scott stood under black umbrellas as workers approached a modest grave marked simply William B. Rose, 1948-1974. It was a simple grave for a man whose secrets were anything but simple. As the coffin rose slowly out of the earth, Nix felt a shiver, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. Within that coffin lay answers, truth, closure, justice 50 years overdue. Samples were collected carefully: bone, teeth, fragments preserved by time. And then, just as quietly as he came, Detective Nix stepped away. His work was not to watch the past rise. His work was to bring the truth home. The remains of William B. Rose were transported under strict chain of custody to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab, where some of the state's most skilled forensic scientists began the delicate process of extracting DNA from bones that had rested in the earth for nearly half a century. The task was monumental. Time erodes, moisture destroys. Even the best preserved remains carry no guarantees. But this case had something powerful on its side: determination. The team knew they were not simply processing evidence. They were handling the final chapter of a little girl's story. Debbie Randall had been waiting for 50 years. Her family had been waiting even longer. And the scientists knew they could not fail her. The lab technicians removed fragments of Rose's teeth and bone, the areas most likely to retain DNA after decades underground. They cleaned. They ground samples into fine powder. They extracted cells, breaking them down to reveal the fragile strands of genetic material hidden within. The process was slow, meticulous, and unforgiving. Every step had to be perfect. At the same time, the original hair recovered from Debbie's clothing in 1972, the silent witness preserved by hope, was prepared for comparison once more. The hair had no root, no follicle, no soft tissue. But advanced technology no one could have dreamed of 50 years earlier was finally capable of extracting something meaningful from it. And the scientists moved forward, breath held, knowing the entire case depended on what they found. Days passed, then weeks. The waiting gnawed at Detective Morris Nix like a weight sitting on his chest. Every ring of the telephone made his pulse rise. Every email notification sent a jolt through him. He barely slept, barely ate. He lived suspended in anticipation, knowing they were close, so impossibly close to the truth. Then one morning, as Frost clung to the windows of his office, the phone rang. This time, it was the call. He answered quietly. "Nick's here." On the other end, the voice of the lead forensic scientist carried a calm certainty, the kind that comes only when the impossible has been achieved. "Detective," she said, "we have completed the analysis. The DNA from William B. Rose is a perfect match to the hair recovered from Debbie Randall's clothing. A perfect match. Not partial, not probable. Perfect. Detective Nix," she continued, "there is no room for doubt. William B. Rose is the individual responsible for the murder of 9-year-old Debbie Randall." For a moment, the world around Morris went still. The hum of fluorescent lights faded. The sound of traffic outside dissolved. The weight he had carried since 2001 lifted. Not all at once, but slowly, like a heavy stone being rolled from a long-sealed tomb. He closed his eyes. A long breath escaped him. After more than 50 years, the truth had spoken. Debbie finally had justice. But Morris knew the hardest part was still ahead. There was one last person he needed to see. The person who had carried this grief the longest. Melvin Randall, Debbie's older brother. A man who had once walked the streets as a boy, posting flyers for his missing sister. A man who had grown old without answers. A man whose parents had died never knowing the truth. Morris drove through quiet neighborhoods, past homes lit gently by the morning sun, past yards where children now played freely, unaware of the little girl whose story had shaped the safety of generations. When he reached Melvin's home, he sat in the car for a long moment, steadying his breath, preparing his heart. Then he stepped out and walked to the door. Melvin answered with tired eyes, silver hair curling slightly at the edges, his expression lined with decades of silent hurt. "Morris," he said softly, "come in." Inside, the living room was calm and warm. Photos of family lined the shelves. Children, grandchildren, memories of a life that continued despite the ache within it. But one picture stood alone on a table, framed carefully. Debbie smiling sweetly, her hair brushing her shoulders. Morris sat across from Melvin. The air between them felt heavy, but not with fear, with truth. He took a breath, and then he spoke. "Melvin, we found the man responsible for Debbie's death." Melvin's hands trembled. His jaw tightened. He blinked rapidly, as if holding back years of uncried tears. Morris continued gently. "His name was William B. Rose. He lived near your family back then. And Melvin, he's been dead since 1974. He took his own life." Silence, a long, deep silence. Then Melvin whispered, "So he never faced justice." Morris shook his head slowly. "No, but we faced the truth. We exhumed him. And the DNA, it matches. There is no doubt, Rose was the man who harmed Debbie." Melvin's shoulders sagged. He lowered his head into his hands as tears, long buried, long restrained, spilled freely. He cried for his sister, for his parents, for the life she never lived, and for the truth that had taken half a century to arrive. When he finally looked up, his voice was raw, breaking with both relief and regret. "If only you'd found this a year sooner." He paused, swallowing hard. "My father might have died at peace." Morris nodded. He felt the ache of that truth deep in his chest. Melvin continued, voice trembling. "But I know Debbie's with them now, and they know. It's over. It's finally over." The two men sat quietly, letting the weight of 50 years dissolve into the air. No more questions. No more doubt. Only truth. Only closure. When Morris stepped outside, the sky was tinted with violet. the kind of soft evening glow that seems to wash everything in fragile peace. The crisp wind brushed past him, cool and gentle. He looked upward, breathing deeply, feeling the first sense of true release in decades. Debbie Randall's story, the little girl stolen between her front door and the sidewalk, finally had an ending. It wasn't a courtroom verdict. It wasn't a handcuff moment. It wasn't justice in the traditional sense. But it was truth. And in cold cases, truth is its own form of justice. For Debbie, for Melvin, for the parents who never gave up, and for a community that had lived too long with a name they never knew they needed to remember. Debbie's spirit at last could rest. And the promise Detective Morris Nix made all those years ago had finally been fulfilled. As the final threads of Debbie Randall's story were pulled from the silence, a quiet truth emerged. Some cases are not simply about solving a crime. Some cases reshape the way a community sees itself. Some cases echo for generations. And Debbie's case was one of those. The little girl whose life ended before dinner ended up changing how an entire state, and eventually the entire country, thought about missing children, cold cases, and the importance of forensic science. For decades, Marietta carried the weight of what happened to Debbie on its shoulders. Parents held their children closer. Neighborhoods stayed alert, and the community changed the way it lived, breathed, and trusted. Debbie's disappearance became a story whispered in schools, repeated at bedtime, and shared at community gatherings. Not to frighten, but to remind. To remind families that even the safest towns hold shadows. To remind police that no detail is too small. To remind the world that danger doesn't always look like danger. And though the years went on, Debbie's memory lived through generations who had never even met her. Her story became a caution, a lesson, a name that meant stay aware, stay safe, stay watchful. When Detective Morris Nix reopened the file in 2001 and again in 2015, he wasn't just solving a crime. He was proving something bigger, something that would change cold case investigations for years to come. The use of genetic genealogy in Debbie's case demonstrated that even a single strand of hair, a piece of evidence the size of a whisper, could hold the power to reveal a killer. It showed departments across the nation that no evidence is too old, no case is too cold, no time gap is too large for the truth to survive. Debbie's case became a silent blueprint that other detectives would follow, leading to breakthroughs in dozens of long-forgotten mysteries. And in that way, she became far more than a victim. She became a catalyst, a reminder that the dead still speak, if someone is willing to listen. For Detective Nix, the conclusion of the Randall case became a defining moment in his career and in his life. For more than 2 decades, he carried her name like a quiet vow. He walked into the office each morning, knowing her file awaited him, its faded edges a constant reminder of work left undone. When the DNA match arrived, when the name William B. Rose became more than a possibility and turned into an irrefutable truth, something inside Morris settled. Not joy, not celebration, just peace. A peace that comes when a promise, long carried, has finally been kept. Of all the people touched by Debbie's case, no one carried more quiet suffering than her brother Melvin. As a boy, he had scoured the streets on trembling legs, asking strangers if they had seen his sister. As a man, he carried her absence with him through every milestone of his life. Birthdays, graduations, family gatherings. Every celebration had an empty space where Debbie should have been. When he learned the truth at last, when Detective Nix handed him the name he had waited half a century to hear, Melvin's tears were not just for grief. They were for relief, for release, for closure, and for his parents, gone now, who had prayed every night for an answer they never received. Melvin said something that stayed with Morris for a long time. I know my parents are with Debbie now, and now they know. They finally know. In those words lived a lifetime of longing, a lifetime of unanswered prayers finally reaching their destination. Some might ask, does justice still matter when the killer is already dead? Is a solved case still justice if it never sees a courtroom? If handcuffs never close? If the guilty never stand before a judge? For the Randall family, the answer was yes, absolutely yes. Because justice is not always punishment. Sometimes justice is truth. Sometimes justice is knowing. Sometimes justice is the quiet peace that comes when the unknown becomes known. Debbie's case did not end with a prison sentence. It ended with a name, an identity, a confirmation, and for families who have lived in the dark for decades, a name is often the greatest form of justice there is. Back at Oak Grove Cemetery, William B. Rose's grave sits quietly under the shade of aging trees. There is no sign that it hides the remains of a killer. No symbol of the life he stole. Just a simple headstone. Dates carved into stone, nothing more. But the earth beneath it once held a secret that haunted a town, a secret that carried unimaginable pain, a secret that could not stay hidden forever. Now the secret has been brought into the light, and the little girl whose life was stolen in 1972 can finally rest. Her story is complete, her truth is known, her memory preserved. Debbie Randall never grew up. She never made it to middle school. She never celebrated her 10th birthday. She never became the woman she might have grown into. But she changed the world in ways she never would have imagined. Her case shaped investigative methods. Her story brought the community closer. Her name became a beacon for those who work in law enforcement. A reminder not to give up, not to forget, not to leave any case behind. Debbie's life was short, but her impact was long. Longer than 50 years. Longer than the grief that once swallowed her family. Longer than the silence that separated then from now. Her light remains. Because people refuse to let it fade. Thank you for watching this journey with us. Thank you for keeping Debbie's memory alive. Here at Beyond the Case, we tell these stories so that every victim is remembered, every clue is valued, and every truth, no matter how long it has been buried, has the chance to rise into the light. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the importance of justice, if you believe every cold case deserves a voice, then please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep stories like Debbie's alive and ensures that no case, no matter how old, will ever be forgotten. For Debbie, for her family, for every child whose story is waiting to be heard.